In this video, we'll review Chapter 32, The Politics of Boom and Bust, 1920 to 1932. The Republican Old Guard returned with Warren G. Harding, who was inaugurated in 1921, and he looked very presidential, but he found himself beyond his depth in the presidency. He was unable to detect moral faults in his associates, he could not say no, and designing politicians leached onto his weaknesses, and Washington could not tell a lie. But Harding could not tell a liar. He promised to gather around him the best minds. Charles Evan Hughes was masterful, imperious, incisive, and brilliant, and he was brought to the position of Secretary of State as a dominating conservative leadership position. Andrew Mellon was the new Secretary of the Treasury, and Herbert Hoover was the famed feeder of Belgians and wartime food administrator during World War I. He became the Secretary of Commerce. He raised his second-rate cabinet post to a first-rate importance, especially in drumming up foreign trade for manufacturers. Harding's worst minds were Senator Albert B. Fall, who was a scheming anti-conservationist who was appointed Secretary of the Interior, and as guardian of the nation's natural resources, he resembled a wolf hired to protect the sheep. Harry Daughtry was also a big-time crook in the Ohio gang, and he was supposed to prosecute wrongdoers as Attorney General. Harding was a perfect front for industrialists. The new Old Guards hoped to crush reforms of the progressive era, and they hoped to improve on the old business doctrine of laissez-faire. They wanted the government to keep its hands off business, and they wanted the government to guide business along the path to profits. They achieved this goal by putting courts and administrative bureaus in safekeeping of fellow stand-patters. Harding lived less than 3 years as president. He appointed 4 of 9 justices, and the fortunate choice for Chief Justice was ex-President Taft, who performed his duties ably and was more liberal than some of his associates. The Supreme Court axed progressive legislation. It killed the federal child labor law. It stripped away many of labor's hard-won gains and rigidly restricted government intervention in the economy. This is a political cartoon satirizing the corruption of the Harding administration, showing the sale of the Capitol, the White House, and the Washington Monument in this cartoon titled Government for Sale. In the landmark case, Adkins versus Children's Hospital in 1923, this case reversed its reasoning in Muller versus Oregon, which we talked about in Chapter 28, which declared that women needed special protection in the workplace, and this was to invalidate the minimum wage law for women. The reasoning behind it was because women had the vote, the 19th Amendment, they were now legally the equal of men and could no longer be protected by special legislation. 2 additional cases framed the debate over gender differences. Were women sufficiently different from men that they merited special legal and social treatment, or were they effectively equal in the eyes of the law and undeserving of special protections and preferences? Corporations could once more relax and expand during Harding's administration. The antitrust laws were ignored, circumvented, or feebly enforced by friendly prosecutors. The Interstate Commerce Commission was dominated by men sympathetic to the managers of the railroads. Big industrialists strived to reduce the rigors of competition through trade associations, and although associations ran counter to the spirit of the antitrust laws, their formation was encouraged by Hoover. Hoover's efficiency led him to condemn waste resulting from cutthroat competition. His commitment was to voluntary cooperation and led him to urge businesses to regulate themselves rather than be regulated by the government. Wartime government controls on the economy were swiftly dismantled, and the War Industries Board disappeared. With its passing, the progressive hopes for more government regulation of big business evaporated. Returned railroads to private management in 1920, which crushed the hope for permanent nationalization, and Congress passed the Cummins Transportation Act, which encouraged private consolidation of railroads. It also pledged the Interstate Commerce Commission to guarantee railroad profitability. The new philosophy was to save the railroads. Government tried to get out of the shipping business. The Merchant Marine Act in 1920 had authorized the shipping board to sell most of the hastily built wartime fleet, and the board operated the remaining vessels without much success. Under La Follette's Seamen's Act in 1915, American shipping could not thrive in competition with foreign shipping. Lacking government support, labor also limped along badly in the post-war decade. The bloody steel strike was crushed in 1919. The Railway Labor Board cut wages 12% in 1922, and when the workers struck, Attorney General Daughtry clamped the injunction on the strikers. Needy veterans reaped lasting gains from the war. Congress created the Veterans Bureau to operate hospitals and provide vocational rehab. Veterans were organized into pressure groups, and the American Legion demonstrated militant patriotism, rock-ribbed conservatism, zealous anti-radicalism, and they aggressively pushed for veterans' benefits, especially adjusted compensation to make up for wages while they were in service. They won with the 1924 passage of the Adjusted Compensation Act, which gave the former soldiers a paid-up insurance policy due in 20 years, and added $3.5 billion to the cost of the war. Making peace with a fallen foe. The USA, having rejected the Treaty of Versailles, technically was still at war with Germany, Austria, and Hungary. In 1921, Congress passed a simple joint resolution that declared the war over. The isolation enthroned itself in Washington, and it continued to regard the League of Nations as unclean. Harding at first even refused to support the League's World Health Program. This is a political cartoon called "I Sympathize Deeply with You, Madam, but I Cannot Associate with You," showing President Harding, Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes, breaking the news to a desperate war-tattered Europe that America was going and staying at home. Secretary Hughes secured for U.S. oil companies the right to share the Middle East oil exploitations. Disarmament was also an issue for Harding. Businessmen did not want to finance naval building programs that were started during the war, and so Washington's Disarmament Conference took place between 1921 and 1922. Invitations were sent to all but Bolshevik Russia. The agenda included naval disarmament and the situation in the Far East. Hughes declared a 10-year holiday on the construction of battleships and proposed a scaled-down navy of America and Britain with parity. The ratio was 5 to 5 to 3 for the USA, England, and Japan in the Five-Power Treaty signed in 1922. This figure shows the limits imposed by the Washington Conference in 1921 and 1922. Basically, the British and the Americans pledged to refrain from fortifying their Far Eastern possessions, while Japan was allowed to fortify its possessions. And this was the key to the Naval Limitation Treaty. The U.S. won a temporary victory here, but paid a horrendous price when they had to dislodge the well-entrenched Japanese from the Pacific in World War II. The Four-Power Treaty was a pact that bound Britain, Japan, France, and the United States together to preserve the status quo in the Pacific. China was deemed the sick man of the Far East and was helped by the Nine-Power Treaty in 1922, whose signatories agreed to nail wide open the open door to China. The conference was important, but there were no restrictions on construction of smaller warships, and Congress made no commitment to use armed force. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 was also passed. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role. Kellogg signed the pact with the French foreign minister. This was a new parchment peace treaty. It showed that defensive wars were still permitted, but the pact was a diplomatic derelict and was actually virtually useless. But it reflected the American mind of the 1920s. They were willing to be lulled into a false sense of security, and the same attitude shows up in the neutralism of the 1930s. Business people also sought to keep the U.S. market to themselves by throwing up the walls for the tariff. In the Fordney-McCumber tariff law, lobbyists wanted to boost the average from 27 to 38.5%, almost as high as Taft-Payne-Aldrich tariffs in 1909. The duties on farm produce was to be increased. The flexibility was the president could increase or decrease duties as much as 50%. Harding and Coolidge were more friendly to increases than to reductions. In 6 years, they authorized 32 upward charges. During the same time, they ordered only 5 reductions. The high tariff course set off a chain reaction. European producers felt the squeeze. Impoverished Europe needed to sell its manufactured goods to the United States to be able to repay the war debts. America needed to give foreign countries a chance to make a profit in order to buy U.S. exports. And international trade, which Americans were slow to learn, was a two-way street. Americans could not sell to others unless they bought from them or lent them more U.S. dollars. So the tariffs were a game that two could play, as Europeans responded with higher tariffs as well. And the whole European-American tariff battle deepened international economic distress, providing one more rung on the ladder by which Adolf Hitler would scramble to power. The loose morality and get-rich-quickisms of the Harding era resulted in a series of scandals as well. In 1923, Colonel Charles Forbes was forced to resign as the head of the Veterans Bureau. He looted the government of almost $200 million, chiefly in the building of veterans' hospitals, and was sentenced to 2 years in a federal penitentiary. The Teapot Dome scandal happened as a result as well, and this involved priceless naval oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, induced the Secretary of Navy to transfer the properties to the Interior Department. Harding signed the secret order. Fall leased the lands to oilmen Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny, but not until he received the bribe or a loan of $100,000 from Doheny and about 3 times that amount from Sinclair. The Teapot Dome finally came to a whistling boil. When Fall, Sinclair, and Doheny were indicted, that's not supposed to say indicated, it's supposed to say indicted, in 1924. And the case dragged on until 1929, when Fall was found guilty of taking bribes and sentenced to 1 year in jail. This is a political cartoon titled Washington Officials Trying to Outpace the Teapot Dome Scandal, 1922. And I'd say the cartoon pretty much speaks for itself. 2 bribe givers were acquitted, while bribe takers were convicted. Sinclair served several months in jail for having shadowed jurors and for refusing to testify before the Senate committee. The acquittal of Sinclair and Doheny undermined faith in the courts. The scandal of Attorney General Dougherty was the Senate investigation in 1924 of the illegal sale of pardons and liquor permits. He was forced to resign, tried in 1927, but released after a jury twice failed to agree on his fate. Harding was spared the full revelation of these iniquities. He embarked on a speech-making tour across the country all the way to Alaska. On his return, he died in San Francisco on August 2, 1923. So the brutal fact was that Harding was not strong enough for the presidency, as he himself privately had admitted. He tolerated people and conditions that subjected the Republic to its worst disgrace since the days of President Grant. Vice President Calvin Coolidge was sworn into office by his father. He embodied the New England virtues of honesty, morality, industry, and frugality, and he seemed to be the crystallization of commonplace. He had only mediocre powers of leadership, his speeches were pretty boring, but he was true to the Republican philosophy, and he became the high priest of the great God business. His hands-off temperament was the apostle of the status quo. His thrifty nature caused him to sympathize with the Secretary of Treasury Mellon's efforts to reduce taxes and debts. Coolidge slowly gave the Harding regime a badly needed moral fumigation, and Coolidge was not touched by the scandals. This is a picture of Calvin Coolidge, gentleman angler. Farmers during this time period were frustrated in the boomer-bust cycle that was the post-war decade. Peace brought an end to government-guaranteed high prices and massive purchases by other nations, and foreign production re-entered the stream of the world commerce. Machines threatened to plow farmers under an avalanche of overabundant crops. This is a picture titled Mechanizing Agriculture. So, just as the automobile had replaced the horse, The gas engine tractor replaces horses and mules on the farms. American farmers owned 10 times more tractors in 1930 than they did in 1920. This did bolster productivity, but also increased the farmers' debt burden, and also led to the Great Depression. The gasoline engine tractor revolutionized farms. They could grow bigger crops on larger areas. Their improved efficiency and expanded acreage piled up more price-dampening surpluses. And the withering depression swept through the agricultural districts in 1920 when 1 farm in 4 was sold for debt or taxes. These schemes abounded for bringing relief to hard-pressed farmers. The bipartisan Farm Bloc from the agricultural states coalesced in Congress in 1921 and succeeded in getting some helpful laws passed. The Capper-Volstead Act exempted farmers marketing cooperatives from antitrust prosecution. The Mcnary-Hagen bill sought to boost agricultural prices by authorizing the government to buy up surpluses and sell them abroad. The government losses were to be made up by a special tax on farmers. Congress twice passed the bill and Coolidge twice vetoed it. Farm prices stayed down. Farmers' political temperatures stayed high, reaching a fever pitch in the election of 1924. In the election of 1924, the Republicans nominated Silent Cal at the summer convention in Cleveland. The Democrats had difficulty choosing a candidate at the convention in New York because of the split between the wets and dries, between the urbanites and the farmers, between the fundamentalists and the modernists, between the northern liberals and the southern stand-patters, and between immigrants and old stock Americans. So Democrats failed by 1 vote to pass a resolution condemning the KKK. They were deadlocked for an unprecedented 102 ballots, and the convention turned to conservative Wall Street lawyer John W. Davis. The field was wide open for a liberal candidate. Senator Robert Fighting Bob La Follette sprang forth to lead the new Progressive Party. He gained endorsement of the American Federation of Labor as well, and support from the shrinking Socialist Party, and farmers were his major constituency. La Follette's Progressive Party fielded only a presidential ticket. They had no other candidates running for local office. This proved a shadow of the robust pre-war Progressive Coalition. The platform called for government ownership of railroads and relief for farmers, and they lashed out at the monopoly and anti-labor injunctions, and they urged constitutional amendments to limit the Supreme Court's power to void laws passed by Congress. The election returns came in with La Follette polling nearly 5 million votes. Cautious Cal and oil-smeared Republicans overwhelmed Davis, winning the election. The electoral count stood at 382 for Coolidge, 136 for Davis, and 13 for La Follette, all from his home state of Wisconsin. Prosperity undermined La Follette's reform message. This is a map of the presidential election of 1924 showing the popular vote by county.